That's why I think it's so wonderful. They can come up and talk to people about it. It's going to help so many people.
Lady Louise Windsor has spent her whole life staying out of the spotlight. Yet when Queen Elizabeth's personal wishes were finally revealed, it was Louise who received the one thing that meant more than any crown jewel ever could. And the moment Camilla's family found out, they erupted in fury. So why was Lady Louise chosen to inherit such a treasured property? This is the Queen's secret favorite. Long before the world paid much attention to Lady Louise Windsor, Queen Elizabeth had already made up her mind about her. Of all the grandchildren who passed through the gates of Balmoral each summer, it was Louise who stayed the longest, settled in the most, and left a mark that the others simply did not. The Queen was not a woman who showed favoritism openly. She was trained from birth to keep her feelings private and her expressions simple. However, those who moved through the estate and watched the family at close quarters saw something different when Louise was nearby. The Queen's face changed. The tension that came with royal duty lifted, and what was left was something that looked very much like peace. Louise was the daughter and eldest child of Prince Edward and Sophie, the couple who had chosen, more than any other branch of the royal family, to keep their children out of the public eye. While other grandchildren grew up performing for cameras and learning the complicated rules of royal visibility from a young age, Louise grew up simply being present. She was just a young woman who loved her grandmother and showed it without remorse, and the Queen responded to that in a way she rarely allowed herself to respond to anyone. Between the two of them, there was no performance and no distance. There was just a genuine and uncomplicated closeness that the Queen had not found so easily with others. The bond between them was rooted in shared passions that went deeper than politeness. Louise had inherited from Prince Philip a love of carriage driving, and the Queen had watched her husband pour his energy and considerable pride into that sport for the better part of 5 decades. When Philip passed away in April 2021, his passing left a space in the Queen's daily life that nothing fully filled. His morning routines, his particular presence on the Balmoral grounds, his involvement in the routines of the estate, all of it was gone. And the Queen felt that absence in every hour of every day she spent in the Highlands without him. Louise stepped into a part of that space, quietly and without being asked. She continued to drive Philip's own ponies and carriage at Windsor, keeping alive a tradition that the Duke had built and tended for years. At the Royal Windsor Horse Show in May 2022, just months before the Queen's passing, Louise guided Prince Philip's carriage into the arena, while the Queen watched from the stands. Those who were present that day described the Queen as visibly moved. Her eyes followed every movement Louise made, with a focus that left no room for distraction. The crowd around her was large and loud, but the Queen's attention was entirely on the parade. It was one of the last major public engagements of her life, and it was spent watching Louise carry forward something that had belonged to the man she had loved for over 70 years. That image, the young woman in the arena and the old woman in the stands watching with intensity, said something that neither of them needed to put into words. Beyond the carriage driving, there was another layer to the relationship that set Louise apart from her cousins. The Queen held a private collection of sketches made by Queen Victoria during her own years in the Highlands, works that were rarely seen even within the royal household. These were personal items, stored away from public view and never put on display for guests or used to impress visiting dignitaries. When it became clear that Louise had a natural talent for drawing, the Queen brought those sketches out and shared them with her. These were objects the Queen did not share with everyone. She shared them with Louise because she trusted her, and that trust was not something the Queen gave lightly. Louise also had a quality that the Queen valued in a way that the outside world rarely understood. She was steady. During the long summers at Balmoral, when the wider family came and went, Louise was often seen with the younger cousins, sitting patiently with Princess Charlotte, and encouraging her to draw pictures of the animals they saw on the estate. This was not done for approval. It was not done for the impression it might create. It was simply the way Louise moved through the world, with an attention to the people around her that the Queen had always found rare and valuable. The summers at Balmoral had a rhythm that had not changed in decades. From August to October, it became the most private world the royal family possessed. There were no state occasions there, no formal engagements, no carefully managed public appearances. There were long days outdoors and evenings spent together as a family. And within that setting, the truest version of the Queen existed. It was during this time that she was most fully herself, and it was in those months that Louise had spent the most time beside her. By the time the Queen sat down to settle her final private wishes, she was not making a decision based on protocol or on the formal structure of the monarchy. She was making it based on love, on years of shared mornings and peaceful evenings, and a bond that had grown between them without effort or agenda into something the Queen considered one of the most genuine relationships of her long life. There was definitely a meaning to it. The estate and its significance Balmoral is not like the palaces that most people picture when they think of the British royal family. It does not belong to the state. It is not managed by government departments or maintained through public funds. It is private property purchased originally by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria in 1852, passed down through generations by personal inheritance, and owned outright by whoever sat on the throne at the time of each succession. When Queen Elizabeth passed away in September 2022, the whole of the Balmoral estate passed to King Charles. But the estate was not a single unified property. It contained within it a number of smaller houses and cottages, each with its own history, its own character, and its own significance in the private life of the family. Some of those properties could be passed down separately through personal wills to whoever the owner chose. And one of them had become, in the final years of the Queen's life, the most personally meaningful piece of ground she possessed. Craigan Lodge sat about a mile from the main castle, set back among a belt of old woodland that kept it out of sight from the roads and fields beyond. It was a 7-bedroom stone house, solid and old, built in the style of the Scottish Highlands with thick walls and window frames, and the kind of internal warmth that came from decades of use rather than from decoration. For much of the year, it served as a space for trusted guests and visiting family members who came and went during the summer season. But in the final years of the Queen's life, its function changed entirely. As her mobility declined and the demands of moving between large spaces became more difficult to manage, the Queen began spending more of her time at Craigan. She arrived at the lodge weeks before the castle was ready to receive the family, settling into its smaller rooms and the immediate landscape around it. Adaptations were made to the lodge to suit her needs. A lift was installed so that she could move between floors without difficulty. Security systems were upgraded and expanded. The gardens immediately around the property were maintained to a standard that allowed her to walk in them without assistance if she chose to. These were neat adjustments made for a guest or for a property being prepared for occasional use. They were made for someone who had chosen a place as her permanent private home, and the estate was being shaped around that choice. Craigan had become, by the end of the Queen's life, the closest thing she had to a retreat from everything. From the formality of the castle, from the weight of the crown, and from the long decades of public duty that had defined every other space she had ever occupied. Meanwhile, the lodge held memories that went far beyond its recent use. It was there that the Queen and Prince Philip had spent stretches of their early summer holidays together in the decades when the estate was still young to them, and their marriage was still finding its roots. Those early Balmoral summers were among the most private years of their life together, and Craigan had been part of the landscape that contained them. After Prince Philip's passing, the lodge became more important to the Queen, rather than less. She returned to it as a way of returning to something she had shared with him, of staying close to the life they had built together in those Highland weeks when the rest of the world receded, and the two of them had simply been a husband and a wife in the place they loved most. Properties within the estate existed in a completely different legal category from official royal residences, such as Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, which belonged to the institution and could not be personally gifted. Properties at Balmoral could be left by personal will to anyone the owner chose, without requiring approval from any government body or royal institution. The Queen's decision about Craigan Lodge was hers alone to make, and she made it with the full understanding of what she was doing. There were precedents across the estate for exactly this kind of personal transfer. Birk Hall, the larger property near the River Muke, had been the Queen Mother's home on the estate and had passed to Charles upon her passing in 2022. Tam Na Gar, a smaller cottage on the grounds, had passed from the Queen Mother directly to Prince William. Each of those transfers had said something about the personal relationships that shaped them. Each had reflected the love the giver had for the person who received them. The estate had long functioned as a kind of private map of royal feeling across the generations, each property marking a relationship, each inheritance encoding a truth about who had mattered most. When Craigan Lodge passed to Louise, It did not stand apart from that pattern. It completed it in the most direct and personal way the Queen could manage. The lodge was the most precious piece of her private world, and she had given it to the person she most wanted to carry it forward. The sting of the decision on Camilla. By the time Queen Elizabeth passed away, Camilla had spent 17 years building her place inside the royal family, and the effort it had taken was not a small thing. She had entered that world carrying the weight of a history that was not entirely of her own making, but that had been placed on her shoulders in full regardless. The public had not been welcoming in the early years. There had been polls showing large portions of the British public opposed to her becoming queen. There had been years of cold treatment at public events, and a media that had settled on a version of her that she had no real power to correct. She had endured all of it with patience and strength that, over time, began to shift opinions in her direction. By the time Charles was crowned in May 2023, she sat beside him as queen, and the hostility that had once followed her everywhere had mostly softened into something more like cautious acceptance. Balmoral had been central to the story of how that acceptance was earned. From the moment she and Charles spent their honeymoon at Birk Hall in April 2005, the estate had become an anchor for her in Scotland and a place she associated with something rare in her royal life: genuine ease. Birk Hall was not a grand house by royal standards. It was comfortable and warm, full of the Queen Mother's old furniture and personal touches that gave it a feeling of settled history. Charles loved it deeply, and Camilla had come to love it alongside him. Every August they returned, settling in for the Highland summer with a routine that had become one of the most stable and cherished parts of their shared life. The estate was not just a location for Camilla. It was the place where she felt most clearly that she belonged. In the years following the Queen's passing, Camilla has also begun to think of herself as the new center of the family's Highland life. The Queen Mother had once been the matriarch of Balmoral summers, presiding over Birk Hall with warmth and authority across decades. Queen Elizabeth had been the heart of the whole estate for 70 years. With Elizabeth gone, the natural logic of succession suggested that Camilla would step into a version of that role. From where she stood, that shift seemed both natural and earned after everything she had been through to reach it. The news that Craigan Lodge had been left to Louise arrived in that context and cut through it with considerable force. The decision had not been Charles's. It had been the Queen's, placed into a legal will before her passing, and entirely beyond the reach of revision or negotiation. Charles could not change it. Camilla could not challenge it. Even though she was the Queen, and husband owned the estate, the bequest could not be revoked. The lodge, the most personal property on the estate, and the house the Queen had chosen as her most private refuge, now belonged to a young woman in her early 20s who had no formal royal duties, no senior working role, and no public presence beyond what she chose on her own terms. From a purely institutional perspective, the inheritance made no obvious sense. From a personal one, it made the deepest sense of all, and that was precisely what made it sting so sharply. The sting was not simply from who had received the lodge, but from what the choice communicated. Every inheritance tells a story about the person who made it. The Queen had passed the lodge to Louise, and in doing so, she had drawn a circle around what she valued most and who she considered closest to the private truth of her life. That circle did not include Camilla. The Queen had looked at all of it and chosen Louise, and that choice said something about what kind of person the Queen had most deeply respected. Camilla was not a woman who collapsed under difficulty. She had too many years of practice at keeping herself upright in situations that hurt. She would not have raised the subject openly, would not have made demands or expressed anger in any form that could reach beyond the private walls of her household. But the inheritance decision had arrived at a moment when she had believed herself to be settling, finally and permanently, into the central role she had spent so long working toward. She had come through the hardest years. She was queen. The estate was hers and Charles's to shape going forward. And then, from the woman whose approval had always been the most significant and the most withheld, came a final act that placed someone else at the heart of what mattered most. The Queen had made her feelings clear in the most lasting way available to her, and Camilla had understood the message completely, and her family might have to as well. Tom and Laura's fury. Tom Parker Bowles had built a life that was entirely his own, and he talked about that openly enough when the subject arose. He was a food writer and broadcaster with a real career and a real reputation, both of which he had developed on his own merit without drawing on his mother's position in any obvious way. He was warm in public, easy to talk to, and possessed of a self-awareness that made him good company in interviews. He understood where he stood in relation to the royal family, and he had made peace with that understanding in the way that people make peace with things they cannot change, by building something solid around the edges of what is absent. He was not in the line of succession. He held no royal title. He was the son of the queen in the particular way that stepchildren are connected to a parent's spouse, genuinely, affectionately, but always with that small and uncrossable space between closeness and belonging. His sister, Laura, had taken an even more deliberate distance from the royal world. Where Tom had built a visible public profile through his writing and television work, Laura had moved in the opposite direction, settling into a private life in the art world and disappearing from royal coverage for years at a stretch. She appeared at the ceremonies that required her presence, a coronation here, a funeral there, and then retreated back into the life she had created for herself. She was, by most accounts, the more self-contained of the two siblings on the subject of royal identity. She had arranged herself around the reality of her position without making it the defining story of her life, and she appeared to prefer it that way. The royal family was her mother's world. It was not hers. However, the inheritance changed the quality of the distance both of them had been maintaining. There is a significant difference between accepting a reality in the abstract and having that reality made concrete and public in a way that removes all room for ambiguity. Tom and Laura had lived for years with a general understanding that the royal family's inner circle was not theirs to enter. They had understood it, managed it, and built lives that did not depend on it. What the Craigan Lodge inheritance did was take that general understanding and convert it into a specific, undeniable, and very public fact. The Queen had sat down at the end of her life and made decisions about who belonged at the center of what she had built, and neither Tom nor Laura was expected to be among them. Their children had served as pages of honor at Charles's coronation in May 2023, dressed in ceremonial uniform and walking solemnly behind the king in one of the most watched events in the world. That image had suggested to anyone observing from the outside a family that was genuinely integrated. It suggested warmth and inclusion, in a sense that the boundaries between the royal household and Camilla's family had softened with time and goodwill. Yet, the Craigan Lodge inheritance told a different story. It told the story that had always been true underneath the ceremonial surface. The story that bloodlines and personal royal history drew limits that goodwill could not dissolve, that the institution had its own rules about who belonged at its center, and that those rules operated without noise, but absolutely regardless of how welcome anyone felt at a given moment. What made the fury sharper for Tom and Laura was the particular identity of the person who had received the inheritance. Louise was not a more senior royal than them, in any practical sense. She was not a working member of the family. She had no official duties, attended no public engagements in any formal capacity, and had made choices throughout her life that moved away from the formal structure of the institution, rather than toward it. At 18, Louise had turned down the title of princess. She had studied at a normal university and lived in student accommodation. She had worked a summer job at a garden center in Windsor, been photographed buying groceries, and built a life that bore almost no resemblance to the formal royal existence that defined people like William and Catherine. On paper, she and Tom and Laura occupied similar territory, close to the family, but not of it in any official sense. And yet the Queen had chosen Louise, not for a piece of jewelry or a personal keepsake, but for the most private and symbolically loaded property on the entire estate. That choice carried an unmistakable message about the difference between closeness and belonging, between affection and trust, between being welcome in the family and being genuinely seen as part of its heart. Tom and Laura had always been on the warmer side of that line from Camilla's position, but the Queen had drawn a different line, an older and more personal one, and it ran through blood and years of private Highland mornings and a bond built without agenda over a lifetime. Tom and Laura stood on the wrong side of that line, and the inheritance had made that fact impossible to look away from. All they have to do now is deal with the realization, the fallout inside the palace. In the weeks that followed the news becoming known within royal circles, the atmosphere inside the household shifted in ways that were not discussed openly, but were felt by everyone who moved through the spaces of the royal family's world. Inheritances in the royal family had always carried the power to rearrange things. The history of the monarchy was full of moments when a dying person's final decisions had sent tension through the institution for years afterward. Gifts that encoded loyalties, properties that made certain relationships visible, choices that said clearly what protocol had always prevented anyone from saying aloud. What made this moment different was the timing. The royal family was in the middle of a transition. Charles had been king for less than a year. The new reign was still finding its shape. And into that process of careful reordering came a piece of news that no one in the household had been fully prepared for, arriving with a weight that neither ceremony nor goodwill could easily absorb. Charles found himself at the center of the tension without having chosen to be there, and the position was not a comfortable one. He had not made the decision about Craigan Lodge. His mother had made it, placed it into a legal will, and sealed it beyond the reach of revision. He could not reverse it without directly dishonoring her final wishes, and he would not have considered doing so. Also, his relationship with Louise and with Edward and Sophie was strong. He had always respected the way Edward and Sophie had raised their children, the commitment they had made to keeping them grounded and away from the worst pressures of royal visibility. Louise, in particular, had always impressed him with her steadiness and her sense of who she was. To take back his mother's gift would have been to contradict everything the Queen had expressed with it, and that was not something Charles was capable of doing. But Camilla sat beside him as queen, and the pain in her household was real. It was not the kind of pain that expressed itself loudly or in ways that created open confrontation. Camilla had too much skill in navigating the internal world of the royal family for that. She had spent years learning where the lines were, which battles could be fought and which could not, and how to absorb difficulty without letting it show in ways that could be used against her. She would not have raised the inheritance in any formal or direct way. She would not have gone to Charles and asked him to do something about it, because she understood that there was nothing to be done. What she would have carried, privately and without putting it into words, was the accumulating weight of what the decision had confirmed about her position in the family's most private emotional world. The friction generated by the inheritance wasn't dramatic. It worked the way most serious household tensions worked, through small and gradual changes in the texture of relationships. The ease that had existed between Camilla's household and the Edinburgh family during the period of transition became fractionally more fragile. The warmth did not vanish, but it had to work against something now that it had not had to work against before. Edward and Sophie were entirely aware of the sensitivity of what had occurred. They had not sought the inheritance on Louise's behalf. The decision had been the Queen's alone, and the Edinburgh family had no more power over the Queen's final wishes than anyone else did. But awareness of the sensitivity and being free of its consequences were two different things, and the relationship between the two households now carried a new and persistent complication that none of them had chosen. For Louise, the inheritance had arrived as something she had not sought, and could not have certainly anticipated. She had spent her young life being guided by both her parents and her own instincts toward a version of royal identity that stayed well away from the formal machinery of the institution. She had built a life in Scotland that was grounded and ordinary by almost every available measure, and she had done it on purpose. The Lodge did not change any of that. She remained who she had chosen to be, but the inheritance placed something permanent behind her that could not be removed or ignored. It placed the full weight of the Queen's love and the Queen's trust, the most private and unconditional version of both, directly at her back. In a family where love and trust were always entangled with power, and where the question of who belonged at the center of the institution was never fully settled, that weight carried consequences that would take years to fully work through. Charles governed his household with care, and with a real desire to hold its various parts together. He understood that families were not managed through protocol and procedure alone, but through patience and attention to the feelings that protocol could never fully contain. The task he had inherited from his mother was not only the crown and the estate and the duties of the new reign. It was this too, the complicated human reality of a family that had just been reminded that the heart had its own hierarchy, and that hierarchy did not always match the one written down on paper.